Reminiscing on the timeline of video game and console releases in the 90s, it's easy to consider the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 as being neck and neck as they fought for dominance in the 3D gaming marketplace. However, the impressive new Sony PlayStation actually had roughly a year-long head start against Nintendo in the West, and almost 18 months in Japan. The problem, however, was that the PlayStation had very few recognizable properties of its own, and the console quickly became a home for little more than fighting games and arcade ports. With the release and subsequent huge success of Crash Bandicoot in 1996, Sony finally had a good foothold against Nintendo as their first attempt in the video game market finally picked up speed. In fact, Crash had become enough of a mascot in the gaming ecosystem that Naughty Dog dropped their own mascot from their producer credit. Obviously, with the recognizability of their orange protagonist, Naughty Dog had to get to work and turn this single game into a franchise. Development on a Crash Bandicoot sequel began just 1 month after the first game was released. Hitting store shelves in October of '97, Crash Bandicoot 2: Cortex Strikes Back sold almost 800,000 more copies than the first Crash game, with lifetime sales totaling roughly 7.5 million. While this earned Crash's second title an impressive 7th place in the history of PlayStation software sales, at the time of release, the only game to outsell it would have been Final Fantasy VII. Regardless of final sales, with the experience provided in their second Crash title, Naughty Dog proved that they weren't just a one-hit wonder studio, and solidified a relationship with Sony that still remains intact and incredibly prosperous to this day. Let's understand how this was accomplished as we uncover what's so great about Crash Bandicoot 2: Cortex Strikes Back. Picking up right where the first game ended, Dr. Neo Cortex is back with an intimidating new voice, courtesy of actor Clancy Brown, and a more devilish personality to cement him as a proper villain. Discovering a stash of powerful crystals, he sneakily enlists Crash Bandicoot's help to collect them from across the island under the guise of saving the world with their power. We also get to meet Coco, Crash's younger sister, who communicates with him sporadically throughout the game and fills a tech-savvy archetype similar to Tails in the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. Coco's addition was meant to be a more family-friendly counterpart to Crash instead of his girlfriend Tawna's appearance in the first game. While American audiences responded well to a sexy female side character, Sony Computer Entertainment Japan were uncomfortable with this, so Coco was swapped in roughly halfway through development. While she really only appears in cutscenes in this entry, Coco went on to be a staple playable character in future Crash games and remasters. As the game begins, we find ourselves in a hub world with just 5 doors to choose from. Each one has a conceivable theme thanks to their unique names, so players can pursue settings that they would either enjoy more or imagine to be easier. Returning players aiming for more rewards will also find it much more conceivable to keep track of all of their collectibles and which levels they need to retry. All of the first floor stages can be played in any order, and while some could be considered easier than others, they really all just focus on one specific type of threat to introduce to the player, spiced up in a couple different combinations to allow for plenty of practice before the introduction of harder segments. The first stage, in terms of number order, Turtle Woods, has a couple of great features to introduce to the Crash continuity. First is that the more dangerous enemies, the turtles with spikes on their sides, are designed as cyborgs under Cortex's control, and it feels a little less like the players just spin-kicking random forest-dwelling creatures. They also have very clear spikes jutting out along the ground to encourage a new player to try jumping on their backs to make them more vulnerable. The platforming is also left very simple on this level to not overload players with the new ideas presented. The first enemy in Stage 2, Snow Go, is even more accommodating for new players than the last stage, simply pacing left to right rather than straight at the player, who still may not know all of the controls to protect themselves. The first enemy to use any sort of attack isn't even aimed at the player, it's just a penguin stopping its patrol to spin for a moment. So the player can observe this pattern and assume that the penguin is dangerous whenever it's spinning. Leaning into the action side of the Crash Bandicoot experience, there are occasional booby trap pits in your way in which Crash has to battle it out with a few enemies before a means of escape will appear. By this point in the history of video games, developers could assume that many people who would be interested in playing Crash 2 would likely have a general understanding of moving in the modern 3D games of the time. It's very well disguised, but the majority of the first Crash Bandicoot game is built tile by tile on a simple cardinal direction grid. You seldom ever need to move diagonally unless you're trying to get a collectible or take a shortcut. With the second Crash game being released in a market that better understood 3D movement, even slightly, that grid system could be thrown out in exchange for diagonal paths and more freedom of mobility. It's crazy how those simple changes like diagonal movement and wider pathways made this feel so much more like an action-adventure than just a platformer. The first Crash Bandicoot game was very clearly all about getting from platform to platform, knocking a few enemies out of your way as you collect fruit for bonus lives. Crash Bandicoot 2 feels more like an adventure, while still being exactly what you'd expect in a proper successor to the first game's experience. But now you're searching for an explicit objective in each level, being the crystals, and exploring the game's environments with so much more freedom. In addition to that, the little things like the ability and necessity to move on more than one axis down a long hallway makes this far more entertaining and inviting. I think one aspect of Crash Bandicoot's design that allowed it to age well is that the gameplay fits what the hardware was capable of at the time, and didn't expect too much more out of the player. At the time of release, even moving smoothly on a diagonal line could be considered a challenge in 3D gaming, especially if you hadn't been playing the newest releases at the time and were just now exploring the existence of a third axis of movement. But if your challenge really is to move safely on a path with a wacky shape, then so be it, that's the challenge. Or maybe you just have to bounce between a few boxes without falling. Simple, right? But it's honestly enough of a challenge given what was possible in a 3D space at the time of this game's release. This design choice keeps the game from being more aggravating than it could have been by requiring far more precision from the player when simply navigating hardware troubles was enough of a challenge at the time. Taking a page out of Nintendo's handbook for Super Mario 64, Naughty Dog gave Crash a few new moves to make action more interesting. For instance, Crash now has a bit more energy behind his jumps when starting from a crouch position or while sliding. He can also now crawl with the circle button while standing still or perform a sliding kick by hitting the circle button while running. This allows for more puzzles involving knocking out low boxes under threats or sneaking under low-hanging obstructions. Crash can also ground pound to break stronger boxes, and can now burrow underground or hang from wireframe ceilings, switching up his approaches to enemies who otherwise have free reign of the areas he's trying to traverse. The enemy designs in this second game have a much clearer presentation of their weaknesses. For instance, those that require their legs knocked out from under them are often taller with obvious threatening traits on their upper bodies, drawing the player's attention to their less than guarded lower sections. Of course, these enemies can also be treated as tall obstacles to jump over if a player isn't too accustomed to Crash's slide kick. Crash's new maneuvers also allow him to better navigate the game's non-malicious obstacles as well. Freshly introduced in Crash Bandicoot 2 is a new box type called Nitro. It looks like a green version of the TNT boxes, except there's no delay to its explosion like there is for the Red Cube's countdown. Nitro is an immediate yet avoidable threat. Also different from the rules of TNT, Nitro will explode upon contact to any side, not just the top, so sliding or jumping players have even more to worry about when platforming now. The Nitro crates often have a sort of acidic bubbling atmosphere about them as they sit menacingly in your path. They feel more volatile than even the TNT crates, and it seems justifiable that they would explode at the smallest disturbance. Speaking of boxes of all kinds, you can see how many boxes you missed quickly and conveniently before finishing any level, even giving you the opportunity to go back for them if you think you can still reach them. The levels on which you finish thinking you've broken every box only to realize you missed a significant amount of them teases the more thorough players into retrying the levels and figuring out where all of those secret boxes are, leading them down the rabbit hole of replayability that the Crash Bandicoot games provide underneath their one-and-done platformer surface. In order to reel in those completionist players, Naughty Dog also made the game's completion rate very obvious whenever the player pauses the game, alongside all sorts of stats such as collected crystals and gems. The game's new engine, designed by Naughty Dog co-founder Andy Gavin, allowed for twice the polygon count and 10 times as many animations as were capable in the first Crash Bandicoot game. The environments in Crash 2 are so much more fully designed, displaying much more 3D architecture on the backgrounds than was seen in the first game. This is especially prominent in the more industrial style levels where the smooth, geometric shapes did a less forgiving job at hiding the simpler parts of the game, like foliage in more natural levels provided in the first Crash game. Many games at this time were criticized for excessive use of fog to hide flaws or reduce the necessity for high-quality models. After hearing these complaints from critics and audiences, Naughty Dog avoided the foggy jungle environments that they had originally intended and instead explored more variation of lighting and color. Utilizing this powerful new engine, Crash was also given plenty of new animations himself. Some of these create a greater sense of realism, such as making Crash look behind himself while running from a boulder, but many of them also just added a little more humor and entertainment, which is especially notable whenever a player loses a life. In the first game, other than something like being burnt up, Crash would often just have a general death animation. Now, it's a little more entertaining if you find yourself making different mistakes, and it creates a better sense of characterization for the now very popular Crash Bandicoot himself. Little tweaks to the gameplay here and there may not seem like much, but those improvements are what keep audiences coming back for more. Just look at the slow progression seen in early Mario or Sonic games. Pleasing an audience doesn't always have to come from drastic new ideas or groundbreaking innovations. Audiences loved the first Crash Bandicoot, and Sony gave them more of what they wanted. This time though, Crash was more fully animated, his world was more fully realized, and plenty of conveniences were implemented to improve the experience over the first Crash title. For instance, players can now save their progress at any point when revisiting the hub world between levels. This is so much better than having to reach the end of a bonus stage in order to save your progress. You can also retry a bonus area as many times as you'd like, so die-hard fans aren't subjected to excessive repetition by replaying whole levels. Aside from the die-hard fans, many players also praised the game for being a fun, cartoony experience without being some sort of lame Cartoon Network tie-in or otherwise simplistically childish game. Crash Bandicoot 2, and the original trilogy as a whole, didn't exactly push unimaginable boundaries with each new release, but they provided more interesting challenges that fit what both video games and players were capable of during that formative era of 3D gaming. Whether someone playing through Crash 2 played the first one at all doesn't matter in terms of the amount of enjoyment that either new or returning players could experience. There are plenty of staples to a great sequel present in Crash 2, including expectations in character growth, additional gameplay features, and improved visual design. Naughty Dog took their hit platformer and turned it into a proper adventure and a respectable series. That is what's so great about Crash Bandicoot 2: Cortex Strikes Back. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we checked out Crash Bandicoot 2: Cortex Strikes Back. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Sonic 3 and Knuckles, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.